Welcome to A Third Way. I am your host, Richard Garner. Today's episode brought to you by our friends at Zero DB. What is Zero DB? It's a drink, but it's more than a drink. I'd say it's a life solution in a stressed out world of high anxiety levels and unfortunately all too many options to caffeinate or lift your energy levels artificially. There aren't enough options. In fact, there are very few, if any, that actually help you quiet the noise. And that is what our friends at Zero DB have brought to us. Again, it's not just a drink. I'd say it's a life solution. Go to drinkzerodb.com and find out where you can either order it on the website or check the store locator. It's in Whole Foods and a bunch of stores probably near you. Drinkzerodb.com, check it out and quiet the noise. Vandana Shiva is a force of nature and a force for nature. Her Wikipedia page says she's an Indian scholar, environmental activist, food sovereignty advocate, eco-feminist, and anti-globalization author. But she's so much more than that. She is also a member of the International Organization for a Participatory Society. And in 1993, she received the Right Livelihood Award, an award established by Swedish-German philanthropist Jakob van Uxel and regarded as an alternative Nobel Prize. Dr. Shiva is a voice for the voiceless and a tireless advocate crusading against the forces that threaten our planet. And we now welcome Dr. Vandana Shiva. Dr. Shiva, welcome to A Third Way.
Thank you.
So, lots to talk about these days, obviously. I think, we could argue there's always lots to talk about as it pertains to the sort of the slow drip of, a movement towards a smaller group of people controlling a larger group of people. That seems to be a historical theme in a lot of ways. But one of the things that this sort of reminds me of is sort of investigative journalism seems to be, going the way of the dodo and shorter, lacking context, social media, et cetera, issues that have a level of depth and maybe that there's a few dots to connect. It's harder and harder to untangle those webs. And one of the things that comes to mind is that the old frog in the boiling water, which I don't know, these days they say has been debunked. I don't know who did that experiment to see how a frog jumps in or out of a pot of boiling water. But what it is, if you don't know that sort of analogy, is that we will jump out of something that shocks us. But if it's incremental over a long period of time, it'll just continue to happen without action. Is this kind of how you feel these days, that regardless of how obvious some of these things are, it just is continuing to happen because it's just not shocking enough?
Or the other way, Richard. Too shocking for people to react. They're in trauma. And I think if you think of the powers that control, we've been through a 500-year cycle of colonization, and I see what's happening today as recolonization. I defined free trade and WTO and NAFTA as recolonization. And in that period of neoliberal globalization, it went hand in hand with IMF and World Bank imposing structural adjustments. And IMF said, you've got to apply this like a guillotine, because if you give time, people will react and not allow it to happen. So every IMF conditionality and World Bank conditionality was a guillotine. In India, we responded to the 1990 guillotine, and for 30 years, farmers have been protesting in this country, and those protests continue. I'm sure the news of the Indian protests reach you, but these are 30-year-old protests. And then if you take them back in history, they're 400-year protests. So the guillotine is the way democracy is killed. Because if people can think and people can organize, they will respond. And response is the one thing surveillance capitalism does not want. And when you talked about the death of investigative journalism, when all the news is in the hands of the digital giants, it takes nothing to decide what will go off YouTube, what will go off Facebook, what will go off Twitter. And the fascinating issue is the more they destroy community, they say, the community rules do not allow, billionaire surveillance states do not allow. But they call themselves community. They take our words.
Yeah, it's all from a completely, sort of uninvolved, disconnected perspective. Sometimes it's almost impressive how diabolical it is. And again, almost makes it harder to convince people of that. You're not unfamiliar, though, with, let's say, David and Goliath type scenarios, famously taking on, the sort of nameless, faceless embodiment of corporate darkness, Monsanto, for many years, and ultimately being victorious in that long, I would say, arduous and no doubt quite difficult aspect of taking on that sort of entity that had all the ability to be as litigious as it needed to be, et cetera. So we find ourselves now, at least from my perspective, and I'm curious to get your thoughts on this, that it's almost like a rethinking of a strategy. Okay, well, wait a sec. The corporations to some degree might have a little tinge on them. And Monsanto, of course, is a brand to the point where they have actually rebranded. Would maybe not be the right group and the right way and the right strategy to move the agenda forward. So let's pivot towards philanthropy. And now we've gone again from that sort of nameless, faceless multinational to, well, I would argue a Bond villain or Bond villains. But it almost seems like a diabolically clever strategy to say, well, if we can achieve the same agenda, but under the guise of philanthropy, not only will we not be resisted, we'll be supported. Is that what's happened here in the recent years?
Absolutely. And I noticed this, Richard, in the 2015 climate discussions in Paris. Now, I've been involved in the UN process of environmental laws, beginning with the lead up to the Earth Summit in 1992. I participated with my government and advisor to many governments in both the framing of the Convention on Biological Diversity to protect species on Earth. And that's where we put in the laws for biosafety to regulate GMOs, because I had woken up to the Monsantos in '87. And so the Earth Summit happened after my wake up. And then there was the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, basically between countries. But because the rich industrialized countries had become rich on the backs of slavery and colonization and coal and oil, quite clearly the restrictions and limits on emissions were to be put on them. In Copenhagen, these rules and laws were dismantled. And the 5 big polluters were brought together by President Obama, who was seen as a very big savior of the planet. And he basically brought the polluters together and said, let's have voluntary commitment. Why have binding laws? And then you had Paris, and everyone thinks there was no climate treaty before Paris, when Paris is really the non-treaty negotiations of voluntary commitments of polluters. And who's standing on the stage? And who's giving the recipes? With the heads of state in the center is Bill Gates. And I said, something has shifted. And instead of negotiations of one country, one vote, and the island nations and the mountain countries from the Himalaya, the Saharas, instead of the worst victims of climate change who were leading the negotiations till then, the tech giants start to read, and Zuckerberg was there and Gates was there. And what were they offering? Gates was offering more fossil fuels, more fertilizers, geoengineering. If we've messed up the climate with side effects of fossil fuels, now let's totally manipulate the climate and create pollution in the sky and put clouds to block the sun, put iron filings in the ocean. And I'm so glad the Sami have just stopped a geoengineering experiment, which shows the power of the people against these anonymous figures. And of course, genetic engineering. So I started then to research, and my son helped me a lot. And my book called Oneness versus 1%, which has come out from Chelsea Green, is really about my understanding of this shift. And you're so right. The new colonizers are the philanthro-imperialists. And they confuse the people, not just with, oh, we are giving, when all they're doing is grabbing. We have a report called Gates to a Global Empire. I've just done a new report on Reclaim the Seed, how even the seeds of the world are now in Gates' hands. And is he following the laws that we put in place through the Convention on Biological Diversity, that you have to take permission before you take biodiversity, before you take the seed, from indigenous people, from the countries where it belongs? This is the Nagoya Protocol of the Biodiversity Convention, which is located in Canada, in Montreal. And how is Gates bypassing it? I'll steal the seeds, and from the ex situ collections in the CGI system, just do digital genomic mapping. You can't understand what the seed is by a digital map. The reason you know what's in it is because the passport data of the seed tells you this is a drought-resistant maize, this is an aromatic rice, this is a high-yielding wheat. All that data is already there, and the seed has those properties. You make a map, and that's exactly what the colonizers did. Make the maps and appropriate the land, and they took entire continents. Your own country. Map making, all map making. So the map making then was about territories and disenfranchising the original people. The map making today is digital. So not only are the tools that made them billionaires through deregulation of commerce, not paying taxes, becoming useful for the new map making, but this image of philanthropy where they give maybe $1 million to the CGIAR and then take all the collections. They gave a little bit to the WHO and then control the health thing and invest in the vaccine company. And he says, this is the best investment I made. $20 from $1 I invested. So he off and on leaks out to Bill Gates that these are investments. And the word investment, Richard, it's a beautiful word. It used to, till the creation of the East India Company, mean make something beautiful. When we work with the land, we made it beautiful. When we work with our community, we help our children grow beautifully. That is investment. And then in 1610, the word became make money out of money, returns on investments. So Gates is doing very well through philanthrocapitalism on his investments, and his donations are actually investments. And if you look, and my book traces this, if you look very carefully, his donations, his philanthropy is exactly in the areas which he is carving out as new colonies. Gene editing, he financed that whole field of CRISPR. He's financed the patenting. He finances the patent battles. He owns a company called Editas, which has these gene editing patents. Take any field, touch any field, health, vaccines, patents. Yeah, it's all about a new form of colonization, a new form of ownership. Philanthrocapitalism is a bit like, you know, originally even Columbus's letter patent that was given to him was about civilizing us barbarians, right? It was a story about civilizing us, and Gates is trying to civilize us today by taking everything, including our body, our brain functions. And if you look at the patent of Microsoft 060606, the world patent, applied for just when the corona epidemic was hitting. It's basically mining brain activity and body activity, putting it through machines, having the algorithms value your worth, and then giving you a crypto value, a crypto value. That's why they have a war against cash. That's why they have a war against local economies. Because it is not just now, if at that time, it was about capturing people and enslaving them, whether it was the workers in the British mills, or it was in the children and women in the mines, or it was the Africans captured and taken to the cotton fields in America, or Indians captured and taken to the sugarcane fields. All of this slavery meant that you needed the slave. You treated them badly. You didn't leave them as autonomous beings. but you still needed the slave. This new colonization can get rid of the slaves. And that is why it's more serious. It's even more brutal. It's more violent, because every new technology is a technology of disposability. And whether the Zuckerbergs or others write 99% of humanity will be useless, then they're figuring out ways, how do you keep them busy? How do you prevent them from making trouble? So we have a disposability, you have slavery with a disposability of the slave, because your artificial intelligence, your algorithms, your robots will do their work, but the resources of the planet have to be yours. And their functions, their data has to be yours. You have to mine them till you get rid of them.
Well, you mentioned, of course, for those that don't know, who are listening or watching, we are based in Canada, and because of that, you could argue that we should have, a little more practice in witnessing the sort of the PR makeover of something to something else. So, if 30 years, 25, 30 years back, there's a pretty radical, considered unelectable, aspiring politician who, according to some people, is just dark, flat, cold in all ways. And again, because of his radical positions, hard right radical positions, to a lot of people is unelectable. And then this person goes away for a while and, I don't know, seems to hire a PR company and gets that fantastic makeover. And, cut to, he's wearing sweater vests and he's writing books about hockey and he's playing the piano. And all of a sudden you get people saying, that Stephen Harper guy, he's actually not that bad after all. And then, of course, we know what happens. He becomes the Prime Minister of Canada for 10 years. Bill Gates, and if this isn't the ultimate gaslighting, I don't know what is, because this was my understanding, and certainly almost universally, at a time where tech giants were deified disproportionately, in my opinion, where essentially launching your new engineered obsolescence product turned you into a god, right? Steve Jobs, et cetera. Everybody loved these tech giants. Even in that environment, Bill Gates was universally reviled. Like, it was actually hard to do in that era. And of course, not just subjectively, because the predatory, monopolistic, ruthless business practices, both domestically and internationally, had started to come to the surface, and of course, resulting in antitrust lawsuits around the world. And again, almost any media story that was written about Bill Gates ended up including this narrative. And then, of course, the deposition, which is still on YouTube, which you can watch, which is utterly fascinating. If you've watched The Social Network and seen the contempt and arrogance that Jesse Eisenberg's character had playing Mark Zuckerberg, well, you're pretty much seeing this in real life. You have a guy who's just dismissive of everybody as dumb, as stupider than him. He's the smartest guy in the room, etc. And that's pretty much a consensus. Cut to, Dr. Shiva, I wake up one day and I have people who've known this their entire lives, who have a vehement dislike of Bill Gates and his business practices. And they're telling me, isn't he fantastic? And I'm saying, sorry, what do you mean? Well, he's changed. I'm like, did you guys have dinner recently? Like, what did I miss? Well, Richard, he's giving his money away now. And look at him. Well, he's got a sweater on. He's got new glasses, and he's got like, it was like a Hollywood level or Madison Avenue level rebranding of somebody, and then reintroducing them. And all of a sudden, Dr. Shiva, it seemed like everybody's minds got erased. And then, of course, not to be overly cynical, but it's the old, whether you can choose, leopards don't change their spots, or you can't teach an old dog new tricks. But the same monopolistic, I will control the sector, and if you're not part of what I believe to be the solution, because I'm the smartest guy in the room, you're out. And then you hear brands literally like Ag One. And all of these things seem to demonstrate somebody who's taking the same monopolistic, predatory ruthlessness that got him in trouble as the leader of a multinational, but unbelievably, it seems those obstacles are removed, and all of a sudden, those pesky regulations are out of your way, and you're able. Is this an accurate assessment?
It's a very, very accurate assessment. It's really a makeover of the new colonizer as the new liberator. Yeah.
There's an excellent book, actually. Somebody who's going to be joining us on A Third Way, Edgar Villanueva's book. It's called Decolonizing Wealth: Indigenous Wisdom to Heal Divides and Restore Balance. And one of the things he talks about a lot in that book, and it's a real education, because again, if you don't know these things, Dr. Shiva, I totally understand why people, who don't want to be cynical, they want to be trustworthy, they want to give people second chances, they want to believe in redemption. That's all good. I get that. But when you start to really break down philanthropy at the level that we're talking about and understand how little of the financing actually goes out into the world and helps people, how much of it is about tax avoidance, and how unbelievably to many people you find out that they're able to reinvest in the private sector through the foundations and continue to grow and make money versus give money away. How maybe frustrating is it for you to have to get people to understand that the guise of philanthropy can often be a wolf in sheep's clothing?
You've actually touched on all the problems we are facing right now as societies. And it doesn't matter what society you're in. Just like when the East India Company was created to colonize India, it then also colonized Canada and the First Nations of Americas, and went all the way to Australia and went all the way to China. Colonization is about imperialism and is about global reach. It is also about a false story of smarter people, of superiority. Yeah. So I have a whole pile of books on my desk because we are celebrating 100 years of one of our most brilliant historians who worked with Gandhi, Dharampal. And he just republished the proceedings of the India office, which is where the archives were kept. Proceedings of the Royal Society, where they used to do variolation for smallpox. They took it there, turned it into a vaccine, made our variolation illegal, sold vaccines. Yeah, steel making. They took it from India. Yeah, all of this was taken. But Gates' history of innovation, and it's a word he uses all the time, but I'm writing a dictionary of economic terms. Innovation is derived from innovare, which means to make new. Yeah. So when the seed becomes the plant and becomes seed again, the seed has innovated itself. When communities replenish themselves and their cultures, which is what the First Nations are doing in such a brilliant way right now, that is innovation. But for Gates, it is the next step of brutal colonization. And he's trying to redefine innovation as what he does. Now, he has never made anything, when I wrote Oneness versus 1%, I went deep into his so-called brilliance. The basic program to professors of Dartmouth College. And he didn't make it, he just stole it. Many biopirates are taking the knowledge that neem, this wonderful tree, acts as a pest control. Take a patent. I fought this case 11 years. Or our beautiful basmati from my valley, aromatic rice. I did an action with Canadians where they pulled off the pirated basmati, patent invention by Rice Tech, or ancient wheat varieties from India, which Monsanto patented. We defeated all of those three. But basically, Gates, even his technological empire was based on theft. Either from the public domain, or he bullied and bullied and bullied someone who had made Windows and was going to sell it to IBM. And he made his life, absolutely impossible. And so the two big sellers, which he then patents, BASIC and Windows, were made by other people. He's a pirate. He's a pirate from the beginning to the end. Just like the 300 people who created the East India Company were a bunch of pirates. They just got together and said, let's create a new invention. Let's now make a corporation where we have privatization of the profits and a socialization of costs. And that's why you have limited liability. But Gates has further reinvented this, and he's now going to zero liability. So you'll see the word zero in many things that Gates finances. He tried to destroy India's organic movement with a new thing called zero budget farming. But zero budget means that you make the public bear all the costs and you take the profits. We have seen how in WTO, the first meeting of WTO was really engineered by Gates to not have taxes on trade in information. And that is how they could ship software to India and lower the costs of writing code and make $40 billion additionally every year. So tax avoidance has been the second built-in program. The third is constantly, I'm a scientist and I use the word technology to say technology for what? What resources does the tool use? What does it do for you? And are there alternatives? And does this perform better? So any tool is always contextual. But the minute you use technology with a capital T in the hands of a Gates, it becomes the new religion of colonization, the new civilizing mission. And you mentioned Gates Ag 1. Just when the corona was hitting us, he announced Gates Ag 1. One agriculture for the whole world, where every agriculture, even in the same field, the crops are different. The soil is different. Even in the same place, the seasons are different. You grow different things in different seasons. The wetlands of India grow rice, the dry lands grows millets. You cannot have one agriculture in a world of diversity. But Gates Ag 1 is one agriculture because he wants to impose rather than respect the land and respect the biodiversity and enhance agriculture through that. He wants to impose his digital empire. And right now, India, he's trying to take over the entire agriculture ministry. He wants to take over our nutrition. And all he has to offer is a golden rice that he's financing in Philippines. And he has said, we will make people accept these foods. He's financing and he's invested in Impossible Burger, fake lab food. He's even, talking about the mental disconnect. He is even financing fake breast milk as the climate solution. If you can ask a baby, you do that calculation. Is a baby feeding on their mother's breast a lesser emission issue or lab milk made and shipped all over the world? And what it'll do to your health? How it'll break the bonds that are made in breastfeeding and the immunity that is built when a baby feeds on mother's milk. So he has elevated technology to the new religion of his civilizing mission. And he wants one uniformity with the digital being the basis, which means you have to destroy diversity. You have to destroy the uniqueness of cultures. You have to mine what they have and sell it back to them as one uniform data with uniformity of crops, which are now raw materials for carbohydrates and protein for his lab food. And according to him, so much of the digital dictatorship is what Susanna Zuboff of Harvard has called surveillance capitalism. That you mine the data, you turn human beings into raw material, but then you turn them into the consumers of your processed algorithms to modify their behavior. So we've had long movement on genetic engineering. What people need to recognize is what's happening now is the modification of our minds by first mining our data. First, just like with nature, first you mine and then you dump. So now our data is being mined and our behavior is to be modified. And Gates said, if we can modify the behavior to give up real food that brings you health, because there's an intimate connection between well-grown food and our health, and bad food and disease. Even the pandemic has its roots in an invasive agribusiness model where you invade into forests, 75% chronic diseases, food related. We cannot cheat our gut microbiome. We cannot cheat it. But with data and propaganda, you think you can. And he says, and if they don't get convinced through our behavior modification, then we'll pass the laws. Now, I watch this. I live in a country where the British tried to make it illegal for us to make salt, and Gandhi walked to the beach. I have had to do satyagrahas, a truth-guided civil disobedience, when the big giants, the Monsantos and Cargills, made it illegal to have our own oils and make cold-pressed oil in the villages. They made it illegal. So it's not that we haven't had food fascism implemented through law, but he is hoping that he'll dumb us all down so much and make us so afraid that we will accept his money-making in every breath. Even his zero carbon solution to climate change is stealing our breath. Because what is the whole issue of climate? That you basically recycle the carbon dioxide. And he wants to continue to pollute while he flies in his fighter jets, and then have offsets in which he will enslave every farmer, every indigenous person through new conditionalities. And that's what he's working on. That's why he has become the biggest landlord in America, not just for the asset value of land, but basically creating the architecture of Gates Ag 1. And as the person he put as the head of this, he says, time is the enemy. Yeah. We've created movements like slow food because fast food was the enemy. We created movements for slow clothing because fast fashion is leading to all of these microplastics and all of the slave labor. He wants to dismantle every regulation. When he says time is the enemy, he's basically saying caution is not on. Precaution is not on. Should be allowed freely to experiment with geoengineering, unleash gene-edited organisms, destroy the labeling. He paid European lobbyists 70 million to try and dismantle the European biosafety laws. And then worse, Gene tries to push species to extinction. He bribed the negotiators in the Biodiversity Convention to not call for a ban. So here's really a mafia man, a corrupt man, walking around like a philanthropist, but it is really the emperor has no clothes. This emperor has no clothes.
Well, I mean, it's not a new narrative. And in a world that, we talk about dualism a lot, obviously, on a show called The Third Way, where, we're trying to find the space between, as somebody who knows something about non-dualism, and we'll talk about that in a second, we try to find that place between polarities. So I know that, there's of course multiple perspectives on things in general, because obviously people are diverse and different and in different conditioning and in different wiring, etc. So, but where I find we end up and what that sort of incremental move towards, a larger wealth gap, et cetera, that's been happening over decades and centuries. What I find is the accelerator, the fuel for that often, because when we're talking about the presentation of these things through the media, through stories, through new leaders, lionized by the press, et cetera, where we end up often in a world where people kind of have two settings, one, this or that, black or white, good or bad. Well, you can always make the case here that, well, Dr. Shiva's not being realistic. She's being too radical. And that in this case, the end, climate change, et cetera, justifies the means. And that, yes, sometimes you have to, you have to break a few eggs to make an omelet. And then in the end, the sacrifices that we make right now still serve the greater good. And that's not something that's eminently provable, but it's always used to be able to justify what seems like short-term temporary disruption for, again, the greater good, yet can often be seen from people like yourself as just as a thinly veiled attempt at, again, imperialism 2.0.
Um, I don't think it's an issue right now of black and white. I think it's an issue of truth and falsehoods. So there's a truth of the climate disruption, that we've taken fossil fuels, buried deep down in the earth, fossilized by nature for over 600 million years. And then industrialism of a short 200-year period has enabled its burning. And every step of its burning was treated as progress. And every step of its absence was treated as backwardness. And in fact, I worked with my minister to write the speech for the Earth Summit in 1992, where we showed that we are a prosperous economy without fossil fuels. We have other sources of energy, animal energy, biomass energy, and it was all there. Today, all of the multiple sources of energy in the world is energy. The world is flow of nutrition and energy, including the totally, not only renewable energy of living systems, but as Schrödinger, a quantum physicist, when he wrote a book called What is Life, he tried to figure out, as a quantum physicist, he knew it was not mechanical, it's not a machine. And he worked through and found out it actually does the reverse of what machines do. Machines dissipate it, they burn up energy, and it goes out as entropy. A seed put in the soil growing into a plant is an energetic process, except it constantly binds energy in a new creative process. And he called it negative energy. And that's why when living systems work, they are not polluting, because they're using the energy they're generating to develop the next step of their evolution and growth. Yeah. So I have read our dear Bill Gates and his new book. When it's being pushed around, you have to read it. And when it's being pushed around in one of the areas, which is, I'm so passionate about this, he actually is saying this kind of farming, which has sustained India for 10,000 years, they should go. And then he's saying the synthetic fertilizers, which are a big part of the climate pollution, nitrous oxides are 300 times more damaging to the climate stability than carbon dioxide. He wants more of that. Now, so for me, this is about the truth of how nature works, how ecological systems work, how ecological cycles work. So it is not the case that we don't have solutions. Ever since Copenhagen, when the treaty was dismantled, I wrote my book, Soil Not Oil, showing that we have the capacity to reduce emissions by not depending on fossil fuels, but also take down the excess carbon dioxide and nitrous oxide through organic farming, healing the cycles, pulses, fixed nitrogen without having to blow fossil fuels to make synthetic fertilizers. Our research has shown that actually the model that Gates is promoting will lead to not just more fossil fuels use, it will lead to more climate disruption, it will lead to more soil degradation, it will lead to more vulnerability of climate systems. And let me just give you some figures. We've done a 20-year study on soils in our valley, hundreds of farms, top soil ecologists of India. We think we are adding nitrogen to soil when we add synthetic fertilizer that Bill Gates is recommending, 22% less nitrogen in the soil. When you work with the plants and the soil to allow them to create their own nitrogen, we have 100% more nitrogen. So the challenge we are in is really the need to shift from this view of empires, of domination, of mastery, of separation, to the recognition that all living systems are intelligent systems. They're self-organized systems. They're evolutionary systems. They choose their pathway. After all, antibiotics were supposed to kill the bugs. And who has beaten the game? The antibiotic resistance game has been won by the bugs. Take Roundup resistant crops engineered by the Monsantos. The plants that were undesirable, which they call weeds, they thought would be wiped out. Who's beaten that game? The plants, which said, I will make myself resistant, and now you have super weeds that can't be controlled in the fields of America, and maybe it's the same for Canada. So when living systems self-organize, they also find pathways of evolution to survive assault. And that is what the engineering mind of colonization doesn't get. And I'll just read you some more data from our work. The zinc is down 37%. On our farms, it's 14% higher. Manganese down 17%. These micronutrient and trace elements make for health. In their absence, what you have is depression, attention deficit, neurodegenerative diseases. All of the unexplained explosion of diseases comes because you have stolen the food of its nutrition by stealing the soil of its nutrition and forgetting that nutrition is the cycle of life. Food is the currency of life. The seed is not a machine. Food is not a manufacture. It is what connects us to life. And 100 trillion microbes in our gut and billions of species outside, that web of life is something a Mr. Gates, who has spent all his life pirating and stealing and telling lies, will never understand. His mind will never reach that level of complexity and sophistication.
Yeah, it makes me think, maybe a Dr. Shiva, Bill Gates one-on-one summit could be helpful in educating. But that's perhaps a proposal for another day. You mentioned quantum mechanics, and for those who don't know, that is where your PhD lies, and in fact, I believe your thesis was in non-locality. So that's not an easy thing to explain quickly, but what it does give somebody who ultimately pivots, I believe, at a need and where, sort of where the mission took you, for lack of a better way to say it. But with this background, there's an understanding unique to people like yourself who really grasp the arguably ungraspable, which is that outside of this very thin layer of reality, where cause and effect and Newtonian physics drive everything, which, to your point, is still at the root of the type of thinking of that, everything is a commodity, 2 + 2 = 4, etc. And of course, what you also understand, if you understand that deeply at a PhD level, is something you talk about a lot. And of course, the book Oneness versus the 1% isn't just a title that sounds kumbaya-ish for you, right? It isn't ethereal. There's an understanding at that level that the separation illusion, let's call it, right? That this idea that I'm separate from you, that we're separate from the earth, that we're separate from the animals and each other, it's very compelling, right? I believe Einstein said something quite clever about that, about this illusion just being so utterly compelling that it's almost impossible not to believe. Well, here we find ourselves at a to call this an inflection point in human history might be an understatement. And I sense from your passion, but also your conviction that's been upticked even in this time, that there's a sense of urgency to what you're feeling right now with the momentum that's building, quote unquote, on that other side. And yet, like I went down the road about 12 years ago, and founded and developed an entrepreneurial venture called The One Network. And the idea behind that was to build an online community of people from around the world that was driven by two fundamental, and they were the singular and only criteria of being part of this community. You understood that we were interconnected, and that therefore, if you're interconnected, there's obviously only one possible way to live logically, and that's interdependently. And although you get a lot of reaction from people that will be like, "Oh, that's beautiful. That sounds great," and I fully support you. We had a one of the biggest names in the corporate technology world, wildly interested initially in being partners, whatever. And in the end, the frustration for them was, okay, so again, we can't figure out where this fits in the business model. Is this a marketing thing? Is it a corporate social? And in the end, the idea, is kind of reminiscent a little bit of, when JP Morgan was asking Tesla, like, so wait a sec, how are we going to meter this free energy? He was like, we're not. He was like, get out. So here we sit at a time where somebody who could very credibly, in all facets, the science, but also your work, your understanding and credibility and pedigree geopolitically and with the people, be able to really start to get people to not just understand it intellectually, but fundamentally, that if we do not shift towards interconnection and interdependence, that this is the only eventuality. Ultimately, digitizing, automating, and commodifying everything, because that's actually the logical destiny or conclusion of a world that's entirely separate and just matter. And I don't know, but I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I feel urgency about that right now.
Yeah, you're very right. We are in an urgent moment also because, you know, the tech billionaires, the philanthro-imperialists have put everything on a fast forward and have built their impunity into the agenda. They're making themselves insular from three things. They're insulating themselves, one, from people's thinking. And so it's very easy to just put someone's YouTube down and, you know, just call it a conspiracy theory. It's fascinating how fast it happens to some of the best doctors of our times. Yeah? So best virologists, best epidemiologists are silence. The second is democratic process at national level, which create what we call national sovereignty. Yeah? Where you witness that national governments are no more making their own decisions on the basis of the will of the people. I had earlier written that, you know, democracy is mutating from being of the people, for the people, by the people, into of the corporations, by the corporations, for the corporation. One could rewrite this into, say, of the Bill Gates, by the Bill Gates, for the Bill Gates. And those he represents, because obviously he can't be doing so much all by himself. He is the face of this period. And then the third is we hang together politically as an international community. And I gave you examples earlier of every attempt at deregulation. Now, if earlier it was about monopolies through software on the program you use in your computer as a university student, but forced digital education has been imposed to the poorest child. Indian kids have committed suicide because their parents did not have smartphones. They couldn't go to school, you know. And we've had states like Kerala, which had had 100% literacy through a public education system, and that's shut down. Yeah. The food, you know, basically in effect, what I described for digital agriculture, Gatesag 1, fake food, impossible food, it's all reducing everything to software. Not that you reduce the material to the software, but you want to reduce the control to the software. You reduce the monopoly and ownership to the software. But, you know, just like basmati was not made by Rice Tech, the basmati was the basmati that we had grown. In a similar way, the seed is the seed that farmers have grown. The food is the food that the earth will give us. But it's transformed and transformed and transformed. And then the transformation makes it look like the new creation myth. You know, if Monsanto was saying we create the seed, Gates is saying my digital programs create the world and its reality. Now, in this world, then what happens to ordinary human beings is most of them become redundant, and that's why those who don't want to be redundant need to think about their place on this beautiful planet. The others become enslaved, and most of them don't even realize they're enslaved because they are subscribing to the narrative, which is what you described earlier. You know, they're falling right into the trap of behavior modification. And then the third is creating alternatives, the third way. And the third way is what has survived through this catastrophe of COVID. I work with women in remote villages, and we save seeds, and they grow gardens of hope, and they do organic farming. They bring me up at the peak of the lockdown. We had one of the harshest lockdown earlier, and we're back in lockdown. And they'd ring up and said, thank you. At that time, it looked like a luxury. Now we realize it is the future. So I believe the third way really is to re-embody ourselves in the earth again. Overcome the separation that we are not part of the earth and that the earth is dead and has no capacity and only our mastery can give us food, health, clothing. No, the earth gives us everything. We have to be partners and co-creators and co-producers. And our work in Navdanya has shown we can produce more food, we can produce more real wealth. And the other big challenge in our times is separation and extraction. The linear extraction is counted and measured. The giving back isn't measured. It's made invisible. So even the GDP says, if you produce what you consume, you don't produce. So they said there are no economies where people are self-sufficient. There are no economies where there's circularity. And that's why the language of local living circular economies is the third way in our times.
Mm.
The third way beyond total dictatorship and dispensability to we will shape our future. And through this future, we will heal the earth, regenerate her, create space for all cultures to thrive in their authenticity, for the last child to look into the future with hope and joy and security.
Mm. Well, that would be the greatest way to probably end today, but I think we'd be remiss if we didn't include just one aspect of essentially what you're talking about, but maybe punctuating it further. Our guest on our debut episode, Charles Eisenstein's book, Sacred Economics, was, one that I'd come across, I guess it was 10 plus years ago, but it was interesting to all of a sudden see these two words that seemingly didn't exist or belong in the same sort of vertical categories being married together. And then the thinking that came from that this ability to be able to understand sacredness, even separate the word from religion. And, David Suzuki back in the day, wrote Sacred Balance. And so there's this long and understandably traumatic relationship with aspects of some organized religions and the rejection of some of the aspects of that over centuries. However, what get, the old baby with the bathwater, what gets thrown out with that often when you again do that dualistically is that sacredness is not a religious concept. It's in fact, I would argue, and I would be very curious to hear your perspective, it's almost the only science, sacredness. And that in the end, this third way that you've just so beautifully articulated, can we get there if there isn't a fundamental shift? And again, we'll quote Einstein here, who talks about, you can't change a problem with the same level of consciousness that created the problem. Some return to being able to sort of appreciate the indigenous relationship with sacredness and understanding and revering and respecting the earth, the species on the earth, and ourselves as part of this ecosystem. Feels to me like without that, the rest of the shift can't happen. Is that overstating it?
No, you're not overstating it at all, Richard. What is the sacred? That non-violable, that which needs to be protected in its integrity. Of course, the earth has to be protected in all her integrity. And any work on climate change or species extinction, which doesn't bring the sacred at the heart of that work, will not succeed. It'll create more problems. I mean, Elon Musk was behind the Bolivian coup. It's called the lithium coup, because he needed more lithium for his electric batteries. Yeah. So if you want to destabilize the country that gave you the rights of Mother Earth, your electric cars have a very heavy political and ecological footprint. You have, my work on resisting the idea of patenting seeds as if they were created by Monsanto was because, having grown up with biodiversity, having been involved in the Chipko movement in the 70s, my entire mind was based on the integrity of species. And here comes someone saying, oh, it's my machine. So no, it's not. So the sacred seed holds the integrity of species. I talk about sacred food and the sacred flow of food as the currency. That is the cycle of life. That's the cycle of nourishment. And I worked with the patriarch of the Orthodox Christian Church, with Pope Francis. I said, if you can make one contribution, the contribution is to bring back sacred bread, which is now a ritual, an empty ritual, which is not connecting to the web of life as sacred. which is not connecting to the empowerment of people as spiritual beings. Why is our spiritual identity so important? Because when we have the spiritual identity, and I received this from my parents, I received it from learning from Gandhi, that the real power we have is the power within. And that power within is our compass, which allows you to distinguish between right and wrong. But it is also that which gives you clarity and it gives you courage. But it doesn't give you empty courage. It gives you what His Holiness the Dalai Lama and the Karmapa talk about, courageous compassion. Knowing that you are related, that is compassion. But the courage to be able to protect in the face of this assault. Just the other day, I was briefing the European Parliament on the rights of Mother Earth. And the graph was a total externalization of economy. It was nature, society, and economy. As if nature doesn't have her own economy. As if people don't create economies. So we've handed over economy to the colonizers and the imperialists. We've robbed nature of her economy, even though the word economy comes from the word oikos, which is our home. Economy is supposed to be about the management of our home. And our role in that management is the social economy, is the people's economy. So we've got to reclaim our imagination, got to reclaim the meaning of our words. And we have played a role in giving away what is ours. The two things that can never be taken away is your spirituality. It gives you the power. And if, we wouldn't have had a freedom movement as strong as we did if it wasn't spiritually inspired. You cannot say no to brute, unjust laws based on lies without the spiritual force within. And you cannot protect this beautiful earth, her species, our communities, our future generations, without recognizing their sacredness. And we cannot do any of this without unleashing our own spiritual powers as our sacred duty. So from the recognition of sacredness comes the recognition of sacred duty. We call it dharma, the Buddhists call it dhamma. It's not that we are waking up to this now, it's just that it's been put aside. It's been put to sleep. We just need to reawaken it.
Well, amen to that. And it is one thing to talk about things, but of course you have gotten to where you are in terms of the public trust and the respect and the esteem because you walk the walk as well. For the people who are watching and listening who want to support that, who want to walk the walk themselves by getting involved in supporting things like Earth University, reading your books, other projects that are on the horizon, how would you direct them?
Well, one is visit the navdanya.org website. And second, write to Earth University at navdanya.net.
And I strongly recommend anybody to do that. Of course, there's some fantastic interviews with Russell Brand, with one with Canada's David Suzuki as well recently, and of course a fantastic interview with a reporter at BBC, which has gone super viral, I think, which is I think a must watch. But ultimately, the books, and I would want to, ideally somebody can binge Dr. Shiva's books, over the lockdown. But if you had to recommend, what you would push somebody towards as maybe the seminal touchstone compass to get people course corrected personally, as well as being able to be part of that sacred service that you're talking about, where would you point them?
Well, I don't push anybody. I partner with people, but the books that have come out of watching mega shifts being imposed on us in a very dishonest and a very violent way. My first book, Staying Alive, where I tried to understand where did this way of looking at the world come from, and why are women called stupid and peasants as if they have no knowledge, and why is a forest treated as a timber mine and not the source of our soil and water. And all of those questions I answered in Staying Alive, because I was puzzling myself, you know, on where did this thinking come from? I'd been busy with quantum theory, and I traveled all the way to Canada because my passion had grown while doing a particle physics PhD in India. And yet my guides, who were brilliant particle physicists, were unable to answer the deep conceptual questions. And all of the best minds of the world, whether they were mathematicians or physicists or philosophers, had all been attracted by the University of Western Ontario, by the Canadian government, for this colloquium on quantum theory. And so that's where I came. And that's where I learned so much. And I'm so grateful for the years I spent there. So Staying Alive was really, my gosh, you know, why are they cutting the forest? Why are they damming the rivers? Why are they mining? The second book, I think because of the climate issue, Soil Not Oil, because it is really about reducing the climate destabilization discussion from being one of our duty to understand the Earth systems and respect them, to first emissions, and worse now, carbon trading, which is what I meant and talk about in the net zero issue. So it's a carbon reductionism. And my latest, trying to figure out how the rulers of the world became the greedy pirates of the world, and how everyone has accepted it. How did governments accept it? How did populations accept it? And of course, from that period to today, every day is a learning. So these are the three books, I would say, that are the broad picture. And we offer courses. I've been asked to do courses. We have the Earth University for physical courses, but with the lockdown, doing it on Zoom. And from earthuniversity@navdanya.net, you will be able to get more information. And we welcome you to join this community of Earth citizens, building Earth democracy with living economies, living democracies, and living cultures as the third way in our times.
Thanks for articulating the mission of this show better than we had to this point. And for those people, again, watching, listening, sometimes struggling with that desire for, you know, what do I do? What can I do? Meaning, purpose. You've just been given, you know, excellent guidance on how you can help the work of Dr. Vandana Shiva, Earth University, et cetera. And you will be part of being on the right side of history, but also, I think, fulfilling that aspect deep within all of us for again, sacred service and doing our best to stand up for what we ultimately believe in, because again, the luxury to continue to sort of neglect, ignore, and just sort of observe as this continues to go in a direction that isn't good for any of us really, or at least not a lot of us long term, that window is closing, and it's closing fast. Dr. Shiva, thanks for doing the work that you do. Thanks for continuing to show up when it can't be easy, and continuing to inspire people around the world to hopefully even be the next Dr. Vandana Shivas. And most importantly, thanks for joining us today on A Third Way.
My pleasure, Richard. Thank you.